Right now, the recipe post type we have is pretty standard. Just like any other post, I can create content, add tags, and even add a featured image. I want to give the user the ability to rate a recipe on a scale of 1 to 5. To do this, we'll have to use something called the Metadata API. Usually, you would try to create a database table and have it store the data. However, WordPress allows us to use something called the Metadata API. What is metadata? Well, metadata is basically just pieces of information related to a post, page, or user. On its own, it's not very useful. Metadata has to be connected to something. We'll use metadata to add and store all the additional information we'll need for recipes. By using the Metadata API, we free ourselves of having to create a table and managing it in the database. In the resource section, I provide a link to the Metadata API Codex page. As you can see, there are only 4 functions that you can use, but they're very powerful. We won't be using these functions, and here's why. Click on the Add Metadata function. WordPress provides a note that says, "This is a generic low-level function and should not be used directly by plugins or themes. Instead, use the corresponding meta functions for the object type you're working with." As WordPress recommends, we shouldn't use these functions. Instead, we're going to use meta functions specifically made for custom post types. Now that we have an overview of things, let's get started. I'm going to go to my WordPress admin dashboard and create a new recipe. I'm going to fill in some of these fields really quick. Feel free to follow along and fill in these fields with whatever values you like. We're not really worried about the values right now. I'm going to make a recipe for a cake. For the content area, I'm going to use something called Lorem Ipsum. Lorem Ipsum is a really handy tool that will help you generate content. I'm going to set this to 2 paragraphs and generate some content. Copy and paste this into the text editor. This tool is really great because you won't have to type in gibberish or write actual content. It'll generate dummy content for you. I'll provide a link to it in the resource section of this lecture. Next, I'm going to add some tags and categories. These can be completely random as well. Don't submit this post just yet. The next step is to save the metadata along with this post. Once we have that code written out, we'll submit this post. Inside the index file, let's add the action hook save post. This hook is triggered when a post is saved. Of course, we only want to use this hook if the post is a recipe post. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Save Post hook. WordPress talks more about this hook, but we want to concern ourselves with this custom post type example. WordPress provides an example for how we should go about making sure we only save data for a specific post type rather than a generic post or random post type. However, if you scroll down even further, you'll find this note that says, "As of WP 3.7, an alternative action has been introduced, which is called for specific post types. Save underscore post underscore post type." Hooking to this action, you wouldn't have to check on the post type in the sample above. To make sure we only process recipe posts, we'll add underscore recipe to the hook name. This is what's called a dynamic hook. Some hooks can be triggered for specific post types. WordPress handles this for you. All you have to do is call the hook and then replace the dynamic part with your post type. Be sure to check the documentation to determine whether or not a hook is dynamic. Just like that, this hook will only be triggered for recipe posts. The function we want to call is rSavePostAdmin. For this part of the lecture, we're going to use the 2 extra parameters that are optional for the add action function. The third parameter is priority. There is a possibility that other plugins might use this hook. The order of execution is determined by this third parameter. If this is set to 1, then this function will fire first before all others. If set to a high number, then our function will fire last. The default priority is 10. We're going to leave this at 10. The fourth parameter is what we really want to set. This parameter allows us to define how many arguments are set to the function. What does this actually mean? Well, action hooks can provide our functions with extra information about the action currently happening. Not every action provides this, but the save post hook does. By default, this value is always 1. However, the save post hook provides 3 arguments, so set this to 3. The only way to find out if an action hook provides extra arguments is by checking the WordPress documentation. At this point, I want you to create a folder called Process. I like to create a folder for functions and classes that process data. This folder will contain all files related to updating, deleting, and creating data. Once again, this is not required by WordPress. This is just the way I prefer to keep things organized. Create a file called save-posts.php and define the function here. Make sure to include it from the index file. This function will be provided 3 arguments. The first is the post ID. The second is the post, which contains info about the post itself. The third is update. This variable is a Boolean value. It will let you know whether this is a new post or an old one being updated. Inside the function, I'm going to create an array called recipe data. This will be set to the function getPostMeta. When it comes to metadata, you will perform 4 types of operations. You can either add, get, update, or delete data. The reason we're grabbing data is because this function will be called whether a new post is being created or a current one is being updated. In this case, we're trying to grab metadata for a new post. However, since the post doesn't exist, then there shouldn't be any metadata for it. That's perfectly fine. If no metadata is found, then this function will return an empty value. We'll use that to determine whether we should create it or update it. This function has 3 parameters. The first parameter is the ID for the post. I'm going to pass in the post ID variable. Then we have to set the key. As you can imagine, a post can have multiple pieces of metadata attached to it from various plugins. Because this is the case, WordPress allows you to give your metadata a unique key or name to identify it easily. You can name your key whatever you want, but you usually want to keep it relative. We'll be calling our metadata recipe_data. Lastly, we have to determine if we want an array returned or a single value. This third parameter can be true or false. If you set this to true, then WordPress will return a single value. By default, metadata is stored in an array because multiple pieces of metadata can be attached to a post. If you just want the value without the array, then you should pass in an array. However, keep in mind that you're not limited to just storing single values. If you don't want to create multiple metadata for a post, then you can store the data in an array. If you set this to true, WordPress will return that array. If you set this to false, then WordPress will return an array within an array. It can be confusing, I know, but just go with me on this one. 99% of the time, you'll want this value to be true. Just like that, we now have the metadata. I'm going to make one simple check by reassigning this variable. Using a ternary operator, I'm going to check if the variable is empty. If it is, then we know that this is a new post. If that's the case, I'm going to set this variable to be an empty array. Otherwise, I'll just let it be. Alright, the recipe data variable is ready. After this, I'm going to start setting some keys. The goal is to store data related to rating the recipe. There are 2 things we'll need to store. We'll need the rating and how many times a recipe has been rated. I'm going to create a key called rating and set its value to a ternary operator. The condition will be checking if the rating key is already set. If it is, then I'm going to set it to itself while wrapping the function with the absInt function. Otherwise, the default will be 0. I'm introducing the function absInt, which is used for sanitizing the value. In the resource section, I provide a link to the WordPress data sanitation and escaping user data page. This is a very important page you should read up on. This page goes over the various functions for sanitizing user input. A lot of great examples and explanations are detailed here. We will be using these functions throughout the course to sanitize user input. For now, we're only going to use the absInt function. there's something I want to show you. Go back to your editor and navigate to the directory /wp-include/formatting.php. This file contains a list of the sanitization functions for WordPress. I highly recommend you look into this file to understand how most of these functions work. You can even borrow some of these functions for your own non-WordPress projects if you ever had trouble with sanitizing data. Let's go back to the save post function. I'm going to create another key called rating count. This will have the same values as the rating key like so. You should have something similar to what I have at this point. The last and final step is to attach the data to the post. WordPress provides a function called update post meta. There's another function called add post meta, but we're not going to use it. The update version will actually check if this data already exists. If it doesn't, then it'll create it for us. It's a kill two birds with one stone kind of scenario. I'll provide a link to this function in the resource section of this lecture. We're going to pass in three things. First is the post ID. Even though this is a new post, WordPress will be smart enough to provide us with the post ID that will be used. So let's pass in the post ID variable. Next is the name for the metadata. There can be multiple metadatas for one post. It's important that we pass in a unique key. I'm going to name it recipe data. Lastly, we pass in the value for our metadata. It's that simple. Let's resubmit the data and the post will now be saved. The post should save successfully without any error. However, how do we know if the metadata was saved? We'll have to check the database to make sure. Open Heidi and connect to your database. Metadata is stored in a few tables. For our particular case, this would be WP_post_meta. Before we verify the data, I want you to notice that this pattern is repeated for a lot of tables. The actual content for the post is stored inside the WP posts table. To find the metadata, you need to add the word meta to the table name. This is true for the comments and comments meta, terms and terms meta, and lastly, the users and users meta tables. Metadata can be applied to almost anything, including your own custom tables. If you ever do decide to go that far, then I recommend you follow WordPress's database design. Anyway, let's move forward. Inside the posts table, I'm going to look for my newly created post. It should be the very last row in the database. The reason I'm looking for the post first is because we need the ID. Now that we have the ID, let's look for the metadata in the posts meta table. The post ID column will determine which metadata is connected to which post. Searching through this, you should eventually find the metadata related to our newly created post. WordPress takes the time to add in its own metadata, and that's perfectly fine. If you look long enough, you'll eventually find the metadata with our key. The key name is under the meta key column. The meta value column contains the actual key itself. The value here is a bit strange. WordPress does something called serialization for our values. Serialization is the process of converting a PHP object or array into a string that can be stored in a database. Objects and arrays can't be stored in a database. They have to be turned into strings. That's what's going on here. If you look around, you'll see that some values aren't serialized and others are. If you're storing single values, then they won't be serialized. Only objects and arrays are. We don't have to worry about this process as WordPress handles it for us. If you're using the meta functions, then you should be fine. However, if you make raw SQL queries, then you will need to take care of this process yourself. Alright, that should wrap things up. We've confirmed that the metadata has been saved and we can finally move on to displaying the rating.